Hi everyone. In this video, I'd like to work through how you evaluate a function that's represented by a formula. So in this case, our function is defined right here at the very top. H of t is 2t squared minus 3. And I think the most important thing is just that you really look at that and think of it as a rule that you're constantly going to be referring back to. So basically, we have the name of our function is h, and h inputs t's. And when it does that, it's always going to follow the order of operations set out over here. So it's going to square your t, it's going to multiply it by 2, and it's going to subtract 3. So h is the function that takes your input, because t is just a placeholder basically. It takes your input, it squares it, it multiplies by 2, it subtracts 3. So again, if it's messing with you that there's a t here, it doesn't really matter. Just think of that as a blank place. That's like input. So you could write h of input is equal to 2 times your input squared minus 3. And that's going to be what guides us all the way down here. So whenever we hit h of something, we're going to follow the rule that we just wrote down. Okay, so into the first one, h of 0, we're going to follow the rule for function h. H of 0 should be 2 times 0 squared minus 3. 0 squared is still 0, 2 times 0 is still 0, so we're just going to get negative 3 out of that. So again, as soon as you can get used to the notation and just kind of commit yourself to the rule and see that rule, I hope this starts to feel really easy. Similarly, for h of negative 2, h is the function that takes your input, squares it, and I suppose I should be careful here. Where I wrote the parentheses in the previous one was fine, but really if we're being consistent, it's never a bad idea to put parentheses around your input, not your input and something else, just your input. And that is going to be important in this example. We then multiply by 2 and subtract 3. So order of operations really important here. First, we're going to square negative 2. We're not going to square 2 and then change it to a negative. We're going to take the negative 2, multiply it by itself, and get 4. Then we can say 2 times 4 is 8. We can subtract 3. We get 5. But those parentheses are actually very important in that one. So if you're doing something to an input, put it in parentheses. You'll never be wrong. You might not need them, but you'll never be wrong. If you're doing something to your output, you can put the whole thing in parentheses. We'll run into that in a minute. Okay, so this is where sometimes people run into some confusion in part C. If we hadn't made our blank space there and we were looking at h of t equals 2t squared minus 3, people start to get tangled just in the notation here. So remember, the way functions work is I give you an input, in this case 5t. You plug that input into h. H is the function that takes whatever you give it. I don't care if it's got t's or w's. It squares it. It multiplies by 2 and it subtracts 3. So we're going to get, following that order, 5t squared. Again, parentheses are really important here because you need to square that 5 or you're not going to be quite right. We would then multiply by the 2 and get 50t squared. We aren't distributing there. Distributing is when you're multiplying a sum or difference. So if you're looking just at the first two things here, the minus 3, that's definitely a difference, but that's 2 times 25 times t squared. There's no addition or subtraction to distribute across. And because the parentheses don't catch that minus 3, we don't distribute across that either. So just 50t squared minus 3. Okay, this next one is a little bit different. We have 5 times h of t. So this isn't asking us to plug in 5t like the last time. It's just asking us to plug in t and then multiply the whole thing by 5. So if we plug t into h, we go back to our definition, we know that that should just give us 2t squared minus 3. If we then multiply the whole thing by 5, we're going to get 10t squared minus 15. So this is going to become more and more important, especially as you go into like a pre-calc. When are you doing something to your input versus when are you doing something to your output? That's a really important distinction. So that one, the part C was doing something to your input, inputting a 5t. Part D was multiplying your output by 5. So h of t always represents output. T on its own is input, but h of t is always output. Okay, last but not least, this is a nice one because this starts to hopefully stick as we go. This is the way a slope would look in function notation, or in this case, because we're talking about 2t squared minus 3, that's not a linear equation, that's a quadratic equation, so its graph is curved. So really, it's average rate of change that we're seeing here. So when you have a linear function, something like this would be slope. When you have a nonlinear function, something like this would be called average rate of change. Same formula, a little bit different meaning. Okay, so this one looks really scary, but you just need to take it in pieces. So pieces number 1 and number 2 are just to find h of 3 and find h of 1. And piece number 3 is then to do the subtraction and divide by 2. So I'm just going to side note here and say, okay, h of 3 is equal to 3 squared multiplied by 2, subtract 3. So that's 2 times 9 minus 3. 18 minus 3 is 15. And then similarly, h of 1 is 2 times 1 squared minus 3. So that's really just 2 minus 3, which is negative 1. So if I take all that and go back up to my original problem, I was supposed to take h of 3, which was 15. I was supposed to subtract h of 1, which is negative 1. And then when I'm all done with that, I'm supposed to divide by 2. Subtracting negative 1 is the same as adding 1. So I'm really getting 16 divided by 2, which is 8. Okay, I'm seeing that I didn't put a solve in here, but I did have some solve in your homework. I'm thinking I didn't do it here just because it's quadratic and we haven't really talked about that. But just to say, if I asked you to do something like solve h of t equals 5, solving methods aside, what that says is you take your output from your function, which the output from h of t is 2t cubed minus 3, and you set it equal to 5. So again, that distinction between when am I messing with my input, when am I messing with my output. 5 times h of t said multiply your output by 5. H of t equals 5 says set your output equal to 5. So we would then solve this equation. Sorry, I don't know why that turned into a cubed. That was definitely squared. Okay, so hopefully that gets you started on evaluating functions. We're going to mess with this a lot this quarter, but just let me know if you have any trouble.